For most, Biruni is a name forgotten within old libraries, a figure of the Middle Ages' golden age of Islam, or a distant character tucked away between complex mathematical calculations in ancient manuscripts. We often label him a universal genius, place him in a general category of a polymath who knew a bit of everything, and move on. However, this simplified version completely ignores the truly disruptive and revolutionary side of his genius. When you set aside the titles, the complementary adjectives, and the thousand-year-old legend, you encounter a figure who is far different, far more modern, and even for today's world, intriguingly rational. Biruni was not just a hobbyist investigating stars, numbers, or plants. He was an advocate for the absolute neutrality of data and the vital importance of measurement. Beyond being a theologian or a philosopher, Biruni was the world's first true data scientist and risk analyst. In an era where knowledge was contaminated by dogmas, superstitions, palace gossip, and assumptions of how things ought to be, Biruni defended a single truth, and he did so fiercely. Truth is hidden, not in what you want to believe, but in what you can measure without error. People mistake him for just an astronomer. In reality, he was a master of measurement attempting to reconstruct the universe with mathematical certainty. A room amidst the chaos, from Khwarazm to Ghazna. To understand Biruni's distinct character, you must grasp the unstable ground his feet touched. Central Asia, in the 10th and 11th centuries. AD was like an interesting blend of today's war zones. On one side, there was the terror of conquerors like Mahmud of Ghazni, where imperial borders were drawn with blood, elephants, and treasure hunting. On the other, a magnificent flow of information distilled from this chaos. In a period where politics were so slippery and heads were so cheap, science was generally a palace ornament to entertain rulers or a tool of astrology to skyrocket their political legitimacy. However, Biruni focused not on the silk curtains of palaces, but on the raw information of nature. For him, science was not a career ladder, but a matter of existential integrity. At that time, the world was inside an invisible cloud of fog composed of leftover knowledge from ancient Greece, Indian mysticism, and local legends. Biruni looked at this world as a vast laboratory. Consider his famous calculation, regarded today as a pinnacle of modern science, measuring the Earth's circumference with only a 1% margin of error. Most see this as the masterpiece of a genius. For Biruni, however, this was not a miracle. It was the inevitable output of the right methodology, correct data processing, and a flawless algorithm. The trigonometry he used while measuring the horizon angle from a mountaintop was essentially the mechanical and mental foundation of what billions of dollars worth of satellites do today. He reached the definitive knowledge that massive armies could not conquer, armed only with an astrolabe and unshakable logic. Intellectual honesty. The quality control. Expert of data, the Western world likes to compare him to Leonardo da Vinci, calling him the Leonardo of the Islamic world. While this comparison sounds pleasant, it is actually somewhat insulting to Biruni, because rather than an artist, he worked like a quality control expert and a systems analyst. His greatest achievement was not accepting information at face value, but rather scrutinizing it down to its smallest atoms and testing its accuracy. 1. Comparative anthropology and data, mining Biruni's great work on India, Tahqiq Malil Hind, is history's first anthropological database. In those days, studying a culture meant either insulting it or viewing it through the biased lens of one's own faith. Biruni, however, acted like an analyst. Despite going to India as a captive of a conqueror, He calmly classified Hindu beliefs, mathematics, and traditions as a data set. He did not judge, he simply documented. This was the thousand-year-old equivalent of today's actual social sciences. 2. Knowing the standards, geodesy and mineralogy, Biruni was not only interested in the sky, but also in what lay beneath the earth. His work calculating the specific weights of precious stones and metals was essentially a dictionary of standards for the market. Trying to measure the specific gravity of a substance with the precision of 1 in 1,000 is not just a scientific hobby. It is an effort to create a secure foundation upon which trade, engineering, and economics can be built. Biruni was the world's first metrologist, scientist of measurement. Methodology against dogma. The declaration of scientific independence, Biruni's true revolution, was shattering the unconscious respect paid to authority. In that era, names like Aristotle or Ptolemy were seen as unquestionable superiors. Biruni was the most qualified status quo breaker history has ever seen. He famously said, "Accepting something as true just because the ancients said so is the suicide of the mind." If a measurement he made contradicted a thousand-year-old theory, Biruni would delete the theory in seconds and trust his measurement. This was the precise application of the modern scientific method, observation, experiment, and result cycle in the heart of Central Asia, 700 years before the Enlightenment in Europe. He was one of the first sterile minds in history who managed to leave his emotions, beliefs, and prejudices at the laboratory door while seeking the truth. Today, when we talk about big data, algorithmic analysis, or artificial intelligence systems, we are actually talking upon the skeptical and data-oriented foundation Biruni laid a millennium ago. He argued that knowledge was not a common commodity, but a tool for survival and precision. Logistics and time, in pursuit of a universal calendar. Biruni's perception of time resembled the productivity obsession of today's project managers. His work scrutinizing the calendar systems, chronologies, and time units of different cultures were actually a complex data integration project. His attempt to reduce how humanity measures time to a fixed unit is like writing a documentation that allows systems speaking different languages to communicate with each other. According to him, a state that measured time incorrectly could not plan its future. To manage agriculture, taxes, war, and peace, one first had to exert influence over the moment and the year. Biruni was the diligent watchmaker trying to wind the clock of the universe. Conclusion: legacy as a steward. Biruni's legacy is not found merely in mathematical formulas or the weights of the 18 precious stones he discovered. His true legacy lies in the operating codes of the New World. Biruni taught us this: the greatness of a civilization is measured not by the size of its army or the coins in its treasury, but by how neutrally it can process data. If you cannot measure, you are effectively blind. If you sacrifice truth to your feelings, you are doomed to perish. His philosophy is not that of a dreamer, but of a strategic guardian. Protecting the clarity of knowledge, purifying it from personal ambitions and the unnecessary dictates of rulers. Biruni showed that science is not just a pile of information, but a moral stance. History writes not only of those who wielded swords or sat on thrones, but also of those brilliant geniuses who, in the midst of great chaos and bloody wars, measured the world with millimetric precision using a ruler and an astrolabe. Today, as our satellites orbit the Earth, our engineers calculate the density of metals, or our data analysts extract meaning from nothing. They are all filling the cells of the spreadsheet Biruni opened 1,000 years ago. History may not repeat itself, but thanks to minds like Biruni, it can always be measured more accurately. And remember, in the theater of history, it is not those with the loudest voices who survive forever, but those who make the most accurate calculations. If this rational perspective has offered you a new outlook, continue to pursue knowledge, because the answers are always at the very heart of what is measurable, the heart of what is real.